Welcome to the Animal Law Podcast. This is Marianne Sullivan, and on this episode, we're going to be doing something really pretty different than the usual fare. My guest this week is David Michelson. He is not actually a lawyer. He is an animal activist located in Oregon, and he is spearheading the Yes on IP13 campaign, which you might have heard of. It's the effort to pass a ballot initiative that would dramatically change the legal landscape for animals in that state. Honestly, if I'm going to be truly straight with you, I have to say that this interview kind of blew my mind. And really kind of may have shifted my horizons about what I think is possible. And I hope it does the same for you, or at least gets the gears going about thinking about what is possible. Before we get to that interview, I just want to mention that I hope you will also check out the Our Hen House podcast, which I co-host along with Jasmine Singer. Some recent episodes that might be of interest include episode 610 with Laura Reese of the Agriculture Fairness Alliance, who is also shifting ideas about what is possible, specifically regarding working at the federal level to shift funding away from animal agriculture. On episode 609, we had two of everyone's favorite activists, 14-year-old animal activist Genesis Butler and her mom, Janelle Butler, and they are both doing world-changing work regarding animals and the climate crisis. And we also had on episode 608, Henry Mance, really great interview, very thoughtful guy, talking about his recent wonderful book, How to Love Animals in a Human-Shaped World. I'd also like to take a moment before we get to that interview to ask for your support for the Animal Law Podcast and the Our Hen House podcast. If you are in a place where you can help out, please go to ourhenhouse.org/donate. There you can join our flock for $10 a month or $100 a year, or you can make a one-time donation in any amount. We would be so grateful. And just one more thing. I thought I would mention a legal job opportunity I heard about, which some of you may be interested in. Since it really could give you an opportunity to change the world for farmed animals, which everyone, listening to this is probably eager to do. Certainly hope so anyway. This is a new litigation nonprofit, Legal Impact for Chickens, and it's looking to make its first hire. They're looking for an entrepreneurial litigator who will help grow the startup organization. And you can learn more at legalimpactforchickens, that's just all one word, .org. All right, let's get to this interview. David Michelson is an Oregon-based animal rights activist operating as the chief petitioner of the Yes on IP13 campaign and serving as director of the Petition Committee End Animal Cruelty. Originally with a background in psychology and public health, David's dedication to animal rights activism began after bearing witness to the pigs being sentenced to gas chambers as part of the slaughter process. After joining the animal rights movement in Denver, Colorado, as an organizer for street outreach, David has since relocated to Portland, Oregon. He will be joining me right after this. The North American Animal Law Conference, in collaboration with the Canadian Animal Law Conference Scholars Track, will showcase animal law and policy scholarship that is conducive to deeper thought and consideration of a particular topic. The North American Animal Law Conference features presentations by prominent scholars from across North America and a culminating evening panel of renowned experts. The speakers and panel will have ample opportunity for live, scholarly, moderated Q&A. The conference, which is an initiative of the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy, is designed to attract scholarly peers and will expose and inspire others to scholarship and excellence in theory and practice. It is a one-day virtual event, Friday, October 1st. Registration for the North American Animal Law Conference will also include the following: two-day Canadian Animal Law Conference. More information can be found at thebrooks.org/NAALC-2021. Welcome to the Animal Law Podcast, David.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. I'm super excited about this ballot initiative, which would change. And if you manage to pull this off, David, you will have changed everything. But let's start off by talking about the current cruelty law in Oregon and why, like all cruelty laws, it doesn't work to protect very many animals. But Oregon has a relatively modern law, but it's really kind of just as full of holes as the more archaic laws like New York's. But before we get to those holes and before we get to all the exemptions, basically, what does it prohibit?
right now, there are animal cruelty laws that would prohibit abuse, neglect, and sexual assault. At least that's the three largest. Of course, the question becomes what's defined as abuse, neglect, and sexual assault. So typically, abuse would be in the second and first degree, intentionally injuring an animal, and the degree of severity distinguishes between the first and second degree. For neglect, it can come down to withholding minimum care for an animal. It can also involve tethering. So Oregon does have pretty strong tethering laws, specifically applied to, of course, pets, especially, right? We see the tethering of other farmed animals, and we'll talk about why they're exempt, but neglect, and then sexual assault. And the sexual assault statutes are primarily banning acts of sexual contact between a human and a non-human animal with the intention of pleasuring the human. And of course, we'll talk also a little about that as well. The way it's written is that it doesn't acknowledge, for one, that non-human animals have any sort of sexual pleasure or interest. It only counts as sexual assault if the perpetrator gets that sexual gratification. Of course, if any other sexual assault law for humans was written that way, it would be abominable. But
well, yeah, laws written for animals are basically very different than laws written for humans. But yeah. I just want to take a step backwards because you said the abuse section, which is really probably the most widely known of what a cruelty law is when actually harming an animal. You said intentionally, but it also covers knowingly and recklessly. Is that right?
Yes. The full is the person intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly causes physical injury to an animal.
And the other thing that I thought was interesting, and in some ways, when you get this very vague kind of cruelty law like New York's, there's a little bit of more flexibility. But here, I noticed that it really just addresses physical injury. Like it doesn't really. You couldn't even argue, or correct me if I'm wrong, that it covers kind of discomfort or even mental suffering. It's really limited to physical.
With the abuse, especially, I think that they try to address that with the neglect.
Okay.
And that's where they try to bring in the minimum care, adequate food, water, and shelter, those kinds of issues.
Yeah, I guess adequate shelter. I'm specifically thinking of things like, gestation crates where, they could argue this isn't physical pain, even though it's terrible discomfort. You could draw a line between that because there's not a physical injury. But I guess that could be covered through the neglect. So, all right. So that's what it prohibits. And before we get to the exemptions, just tell me, who is an animal under this law?
Yes, so there is a pretty specific list. It essentially covers mammals. It does cover fish, amphibians, aquatic animals.
It's pretty broad, except it doesn't get into the whole insect problem. It doesn't cover insects, right?
Yes. So importantly, Oregon Revised Statutes defines an animal as any non-human mammal, bird, reptile, amphibian, or fish. So it does not include insects in that definition. So
we don't have to worry about that argument.
Yes, which we have gotten some questions about that from the campaign.
I have no doubt, because laws like New York's, which I said, as I mentioned, is very archaic and very simplistic. It just says all animals, so what is that? Then you have to think about what that means when it comes to insects. Not that insects shouldn't be covered, everybody. I know they should be, but that gets complicated. All right. So the exemptions from Oregon's law are specifically spelled out. Again, this is different from states like New York, which just kind of, and the ones that I think people may be more familiar with, they just exempt any suffering that's maybe quote unquote unnecessary, that's necessary or justifiable. So it's very general, but they actually spell them out in Oregon, don't they? And can you tell us what they are?
Oregon Revised Statutes has a section that goes through, lists the exemptions that apply to all of the animal cruelty law statutes. So those exemptions would be the treatment of livestock being transported by their owner, animals involved in rodeos or similar exhibitions, animals that are commercially grown poultry, animals subject to good animal husbandry practices, the killing of livestock according to slaughter methods that are laid out in statute as well, lawful fishing, hunting, and trapping, wildlife management practices, lawful scientific or agricultural research, reasonable activities undertaken in connection with the control of vermin or pests, and reasonable handling and training techniques.
Yeah, that's pretty. I can't think of any that they haven't thought of that aren't pretty much covered there. I thought it was interesting They twice exempt animals subject to good husbandry practices, don't they? Like both in the statute itself and then they list it again in the exemptions, just in case you didn't get it.
Yeah, I'm curious what the history, maybe one came before the other. But yeah, they do list it, animal husbandry practices, separately under the abuse statutes in particular, and then again later on.
And do they ever define what good husbandry practices are?
So good animal husbandry practices is defined as not limited to the dehorning of cattle, the docking of horses, sheep, or swine, and the castration or neutering of livestock according to accepted practices of veterinary medicine or animal husbandry.
But not limited to.
Yeah, it includes, but is not limited to those things. So really, the
that
vague
doesn't
part,
really tell us much at all, does it? Yeah.
Any standard animal husbandry practice is just by definition good animal husbandry, which is useless.
So before we get to talking about the change, do you think that the current cruelty protections, do you think people are deceived by them, that they undermine the efforts to get better treatment for animals by giving people like a false sense of how we treat animals?
Absolutely. I think that there is a lot of humane washing that way outside of Oregon. I think the world globally, I think there's a lot of humane washing, and part of that can benefit from people talking about, in Oregon specifically, we reference often that we have very strong animal cruelty protections. I forget which organization, but put out a map of just the different states and sort of ranked how the strength of their animal cruelty laws. Oregon was very high ranking. And so I think people do have this understanding that, oh, well, we've already done that. We've taken care of that issue. In our state, animals aren't being abused because we have these laws. But people aren't aware of those exemptions. And when I talk to people on the street gathering signatures, they talk to me and we talked with them about the exemptions. And they're really shocked with just how, I think that's really the major deception in Oregon, is that by themselves, if you just read the statute on animal abuse, you would think, oh, that sounds really strong. It seems very straightforward, makes common sense. You don't want to intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly injure an animal. But then when you read out the list of, multiple exemptions, it hollows out the effect.
Yeah, seriously hollows out. We've been saying that for a long time, and certainly Gary Francione was saying it as long ago as a very, very long time ago. But it's still true that people, it does create a false impression. That kind of covers more or less current Oregon law on cruelty to animals. And I don't want to get to your specific initiative quite yet, because I just want to talk about what initiatives are in general. And I know this is pretty basic, but the fact is that half the states don't have the initiative process. So can you just describe, probably everybody knows what it is because of California and they always have, but still, just in case there are a few people out there who don't know how, what a ballot initiative is and how it works. Can you talk about that?
In Oregon, we're very fortunate to have this initiative process. This is where any Oregon citizen can put forward a change to either the revised statutes or the state constitution. There are slightly different requirements depending on which route you go, but essentially any citizen can put forward this change and they begin gathering enough signatures. If they meet a certain signature requirement, it'll then be guaranteed to be put on the ballot. Throughout that process, there's a couple extra steps. So in Oregon in particular, our first goal was, of course, to draft IP13, the actual text of the initiative. We submit it to the Secretary of State, and we get approval to gather what are called sponsorship signatures. And those are the first 1,000 people to sign the initiative. Once we get that, we submit those signatures. They get verified. The text of IP13 gets sent to the Attorney General, or at least their office, and they create the summary language. So what would actually be on the ballot if we were to then qualify in 2022 or whatever the election cycle may be. There's a little bit of review back and forth process where we can submit revisions for that ballot summary. And then we get approval for the final signature gathering. And then the rest of the way is just the gathering signatures until the deadline. If we meet our signature requirement, it gets on the ballot. And one of the reasons why we went this route is that this doesn't require the endorsement of representatives. The ballot initiative process is entirely citizen-driven. If we gather enough Oregon residents who are registered to vote, who sign on to this initiative, it'll be on the ballot. That's really the most powerful part of this initiative process.
How many signatures are we talking about?
For our initiative, we need 112,000 and change. 112,020 is the specific number of signatures from registered voters. Typically, there's our goal is to gather a little bit more than that because there's always going to be some quality control, but that's the magic number for us.
What is the organization that you are working with that is planning on gathering these signatures?
The petition committee that was formed for this initiative in particular is called End Animal Cruelty. We're just a local, essentially is a requirement to get set up when you're doing a ballot initiative. All of the finances have to be kept in the name of a petition committee. Donations have to be accepted and processed through that committee. So that is it. We have had a little bit of support. We're very grateful from the Pollination Project. They've given us a little bit of a seed grant to help with this process. But otherwise, it is just a very tight-knit, small group of activists trying to get this off the ground.
And where exactly are you in the process? I know you just completed an important step, but I'm not sure exactly where that is in the process that you just described.
So about a month ago, we got final approval to collect all of the remaining signatures. So we gathered those sponsorship signatures. They were verified. We got a first round of ballot title summary language. We submitted revisions for that. We went sort of back and forth, and we got the final approval once it was no longer going to be reviewed. There was the potential that opponents could have appealed to the state Supreme Court and tried to change the language further. They chose not to. And so fortunately, we got to get approved to gather signatures a little bit earlier than we had anticipated, which is great because more time, the better. So now we have until July 8th of 2022 to collect those signatures.
I just remember talking to somebody about the Colorado ballot initiative, and it seemed to have gone the other way. The agricultural arm of the animal abuse industries did go to the Supreme Court, and they did get it kicked out. Do you have any idea why that didn't happen to you?
I have thought about it, certainly. I think part of it, the initiatives were written a little bit differently. And so in part because of that, I think people in Oregon may have seen that there was less likelihood it would have been successful, that fight. What they ended up getting the Colorado initiative on was this idea of a single subject requirement, which both Oregon and Colorado have for initiative petitions. Initiative petitions by law are supposed to be about a single subject. And they argued in Colorado that it started, the two subjects were essentially animal cruelty, but then also the regulation of slaughter methods. And unfortunately, in my opinion, the Supreme Court decided that they were correct, that it was two different subjects, and it became invalid. In Oregon, the way our single subject requirement is written and the way that IP13 is written, it is so strictly, all of the text is about the animal cruelty statutes. We don't go into any of the statutes that are written about slaughter methods. We really try to keep it focused on just the exemptions to animal cruelty laws. So there was really I don't think there's any reasonable view that we have two different subjects in our initiative. So I think that's partially why. It may also have been a slight lack of organization, or potentially they didn't see the value in it. Personally, I was worried that even if they didn't think it would pass, they were going to appeal just to delay the signature gathering process.
Right.
Because that could hold it up for quite a few months. That happened a couple election cycles ago. I was looking through the records, and I think it delayed their process by about 6 months. So that was my biggest concern. I'm very grateful that we didn't have to deal with that.
I'm shocked and pleased that they did not do that, because, and we'll get into this, there are many reasons to do this. One is obviously to get it passed, but it's obviously also a huge educational opportunity. So you don't want to lose that time just arguing about nonsense. Now, that was all kind of preliminary that we've talked about so far. Let's talk about the actual initiative, the actual law that you are trying to get passed. What exactly would the initiative do in terms of changing the language of the Oregon cruelty law? Just give me your overview, and then we'll talk about some of the specifics. And largely what it would do is just get rid of those exemptions that you mentioned, right?
Yes, exactly. That is the biggest impact that IP13 would have, is it removes those exemptions from our cruelty laws, almost all of them. The only exemption that it keeps that was previously there was an exemption for veterinary practices. That is primarily so things like spaying, neutering, euthanasia administered by a vet, that would still be protected under the law. We also have added language that clarifies that self-defense is still a valid exemption. No one has ever been tried in the history of Oregon for acting in self-defense against an animal that resulted in the death of that animal. But we wanted just to make clear, because this initiative removes so many other exemptions, we wanted to be very clear that self-defense is still, of course, a valid justification for intentionally harming another animal. But by removing all of the other exemptions, good animal husbandry, slaughtering, hunting, fishing, trapping, research, exhibitions, it greatly expands the breadth of coverage and protection that these animal cruelty laws would provide, primarily in terms of which animals are being protected. Although the cruelty laws aren't written in such a way that it explicitly only applies to dogs and cats, it effectively only applies to animals that are pets, companions. Because the way the exemptions are written, any animals on farms, in research labs, in exhibitions, in the wild, they're just not protected. And so, in effect, IP13 would expand that coverage to protect all of those animals within the whole state. It would make Oregon a sanctuary state for animals, at least those who are legally defined as animals under Oregon state law.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I mean, I think you said it like this, but just to reiterate, perhaps, that it doesn't exempt farm animals, except does seem to like pretty much totally exempt poultry. So if somebody went in and gratuitously tortured a cow, that would still be against the law. It just manages to exempt everything that is done to profit people from all of these potential uses of animals. So that is how the current law, as all cruelty laws, basically, either explicitly or at least purport to exempt animals. One thing I was confused about is, would it totally ban killing an animal except in self-defense? There was something in there about that it banned cruelly killing an animal. Is there a distinction there?
I do not believe that distinction is defined. So it does specify cruelly killing an animal. The way that I've interpreted it and the way that I believe the Attorney General, based off of their summary language, interprets it, and I can actually read what they said was the result of the yes. So their actual wording was a yes vote would criminalize injuring/killing animals, including farming, ranching, hunting, fishing, trapping, pest control, research and teaching, exceptions for veterinary practices, self-defense. So they're pretty clear that this would criminalize the intentional killing of animals in Oregon.
Yeah, except in self-defense.
Except in self-defense, and again, with veterinary euthanasia. So I've had a couple people who have asked me, if we have a dog with terminal cancer, are we allowed to euthanize if this were to pass? And of course, those kinds of things would still be exempt. Primarily, the difference is still for the benefit of the animal. I think that's really the key. Veterinary practices are exempt for that purpose.
So if people are listening and they weren't familiar with this before, they're probably now going, what did he say?
Yes.
What? So maybe you could reiterate that. It pretty much bans people from, and it bans other things as well, but from killing animals for any reason other than the few, basically self-defense and euthanasia, which basically changes completely everything.
Yes. Oh, it would, like I said, it would make Oregon a sanctuary state. And, on sanctuaries, animals aren't killed for, it is definitely shocking for some to hear because it's so unthinkable to many of us. Even a lot of other vegans, a lot of other animal rights activists, the idea of this initiative is incredibly radical because in our lifetime, most people, I certainly, 2 years ago would have thought this would never happen in my lifetime, let alone would I ever get to vote on it, let alone would someone even ask me if I wanted to vote on this, right? And I think that's part of the appeal to this initiative is it gets people asking, is this our goal? Is this the goal we want? And is this something that we can achieve? Is this something we should try and fight for in our lifetime, not just 100 years from now? I mean, should we be trying to make these changes now? For a lot of people who aren't vegan or animal rights activists, this might also be the first time they're even approached with the idea that this is possible. I think a lot of people I talk to on the streets, they think that there's no way that something like this could ever happen. So it hasn't even occurred, in their minds as a real possibility. I think as soon as, if we get on the ballot and a ballot gets sent to almost 3 million registered voters in Oregon, and they're asked the question, should we prohibit intentionally killing animals for all of these reasons? That alone, I think, is going to make a lot of people question whether we really should be doing this for the first time.
Yeah, the educational possibilities are extraordinary. But as I said, you also want to win. I can't imagine that that it isn't farming that is the most fundamental question that arises, but also actually a really important point when it comes to farming is that though it would be a huge big deal, you're not suggesting that people won't be eating meat anymore. I mean, it's not going to ban the sale of meat. It's not going to ban the import into Oregon of meat of animals who have been killed in other states, right? So you're not banning meat. You're just banning killing.
Yes, exactly. So it does not regulate the sale or purchasing or consumption of any animal products. So it would still be legal to import those products from out of states. It just would be illegal to kill them within the state, kill any animals within the state of Oregon specifically. I think to your point about farming being the biggest, that was going to be my expectation as well going into this. But I think the strongest backlash has actually been from hunting and the hunting groups. Yes. In Oregon, we're one of the states that does not guarantee the right to hunt in our constitution. There are some states that do. Quite a few years ago, they tried to add that to our constitution and it was not successful. But because of that, this initiative would criminalize the practice of hunting throughout the state, which is at least has a substantial base here who support hunting. And they certainly, I think, have been the most vocal opponents to this so far.
Interesting. What about medical experimentation? Do people talk about, I mean, Oregon has huge universities and I'm sure there's lots of medical experimentation that goes on. Have you heard of, because it doesn't just ban killing, it bans, I guess there might be some experiments that could be done, like psychological experiments or something that wouldn't necessarily come under this law, but it would pretty much get rid of all of them, wouldn't it?
Yeah, because it would ban the intentional injuring, not just killing. So anything that involves, and it would also ban withholding minimum care, which is often the common practice in those research labs where they're not provided adequate food, water, and shelter, things like that. When I talk to people on the streets about this, it occasionally comes up and I let them know, it doesn't ban research using animals. It just bans the abuse, neglect, and sexual assault of animals during the research process as it is defined. So it would just ban the intentional injury of them. We do have organizations like OHSU, Oregon, a couple different universities that use animal testing. We have the National Primate Research Lab here as well. So there are certainly places that be affected. They have been quiet, to my knowledge. And I think part of that is either because they haven't heard of it, which I think is not that likely given the response we've gotten on the ground, but they may be waiting to see if this makes it to the ballot before they say anything one way or another.
If it starts getting serious, I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot more from a lot of people. So could a rancher raise animals in Oregon and then ship them elsewhere for slaughter? Or are there's such... I know one of the things it would also prohibit is artificial insemination. Is that right? And I don't think you can do animal agriculture at a serious level without artificial insemination, can you?
Yes, that is one of the other big effects of IP13. So in Oregon, like I was mentioning earlier, our sexual assault laws, they define sexual assault as sexual contact only when the human was doing that sexual contact for their own sexual gratification. We have removed that language and made it very clear. Similarly, we're just expanding the breadth of coverage that this provides. It is any sexual contact, not just for the human's pleasure, but for an animal's pleasure or for the forcible impregnation of that animal. It is personally abominable to me. It was just disheartening and confusing to me that when it comes to humans, the UN has declared that forced impregnation is a crime against humanity. I mean, it's one of the worst crimes on the International Criminal Court. And yet when we do this to animals, it's just every day.
Yeah, just another day.
Just another day. And so we want to recognize that forced impregnation is sexual assault. And so that would ban the artificial insemination of animals. And it is widely used in Oregon, in the world, as part of animal agriculture. It isn't the only breeding method. So some farms still have sort of natural propagation. They allow their animals to breed, to have sex on their own. But it's very uncommon. It's less efficient for them financially. It puts the farmers in a little bit more risk. So I've heard. So there are economic reasons why they use artificial insemination, and that practice would be banned in the state of Oregon as well.
So are most animal products in Oregon homegrown, so to speak, or are they currently importing really a large percentage of meat, dairy, whatever, eggs, and anything else?
Fortunately, in Oregon, our farming industry is not quite as robust as other states. So I think one of the reasons, and this goes back to why Colorado had a little bit more backlash, they have